Okay, thanks for joining us today. To begin with, I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the Awabakal people, the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on here in Newcastle, and acknowledge any traditional custodians of the land joining us today, and pay my respects, past and present, to elders, including those that may be here today as well. It's a pleasure to have everyone here today in Social Science Week to join us for this seminar based out of the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre called Young People Making the Future, Activists, Practices and Enmeshments. So the motivation for the seminar is, as youth studies researchers, we know a lot of the problems in young people's lives. They tend to be at the vanguard and pointy end of precarious labour markets and, different forms of reactionary politics and increasingly problematic economics. But what we also know as youth studies researchers is that many young people individually, as groups, different cohorts, are doing different things to kind of make the world and make the future. So we wanted to kind of, I suppose, have a look at some of those things today. So we have three different presentations from France, from Amsterdam, from Melbourne and Newcastle. To cover aspects of this, we're going to be looking at climate change protests, going to be looking at everyday feminisms, and going to be looking at the way that friendships and things like that can also have influence on making the future as well. So what we'll do is run it like pretty much a conference session where we'll have 20-minute papers with a few minutes of questions for each paper at the end, and then we'll have some time at the end to take discussion and take some questions there as well. So if you have any questions throughout, please put them on the chat, pardon me, and I'll put them to the speakers. And obviously, can everyone make sure that you have your microphones on mute throughout. So we're going to start with Sarah Pickard, who's, if you want to share your screen now, Sarah, who's going to talk about young environmental activists, motivations, mobilizations and methods, findings from fieldwork. Thanks, Sarah. And don't forget to unmute yourself, Sarah.
Hi everyone, thank you very much to Stephen to organise this, and I hope you're enjoying the Social Sciences Week, those of you that are part of it. So I'm going to talk to you about young environmental activists, motivations, mobilisations and methods and findings from some of the fieldwork that I've been doing alone and with others. And I'm going to show you lots of photos, because especially of placards, because it's part of what I've been working on. And it's going to be linked up to the idea of do-it-ourselves politics. And here we have a placard at the end of COP26 in a field after a long day of protests when we were doing interviews. So, mobilisation. I'm going to start by, why is the young environmental activist wave of activism at the moment so important, just to underline why we should be paying attention to it. So we know that young people have been increasingly engaging in environmental activism since late 2018. That doesn't mean to say it didn't exist before, but we all know that it's been on the increase since then, and it's sustained. So it's significant because of that. It's carried on through COVID and it's still going on. And we've got two big events coming up in the near future, from Fridays for Future and from Extinction Rebellion. It's significant because there's a critical mass. There are big numbers involved. Bigger than any other particular issue in recent years, and because it is, of course, both the global south and the global north. Speaking to you from the global north, to most of you in the global south today. It's significant because it's well known, it's been in the media, it's been talked about. Of course, it's significant because it's a huge, urgent issue that seems particularly important to young people, and that's all part of the narratives that are used about apocalyptic forecasts and those that we've all heard about. It's also particularly important to young people because of the large range of emotions that are involved, and I'll be talking about that in a minute. And these emotions impact activism, both from putting a brake on it, but also to mobilising young people. So young people's mobilization today is nothing new. There's been environmental activism for decades or centuries, but and the current activism builds on previous generation of activism, but also adapts it, using a wide repertoire of contention, both offline and online, that I can talk about later on. I think it's significant, and we're in a youth studies research group here, that it was started by a 15-year-old, so a child, a young person who doesn't have the right to vote. And because of the wide range of young activists involved, going from school pupils from primary school that don't have the right to vote to young adults. And we all know about the transitions to adulthood taking longer. So, and these young people have been living through a series of crises that have particularly affected them. Nevertheless, despite the very material problems that they've been going through, environmental activism is not focused on the new young people per se. It's not about education or access to education or funding. So it's something that is beyond that, which means that it's dissimilar to many of the protests we saw in England, at least in recent years. Also regarding young people themselves, it's important because it challenges representations, or we could say misrepresentations, of young people as being political people and their political participation and their capacity to deal with political information and come up with solutions for it. So it challenges stereotypes about young people being immature that are shown in the media, but also in politicians, including the previous Australian Prime Minister. And it's also significant because of their actions. They are provoking political, public and media reactions to climate change. And we've definitely seen effects of that in Britain, for example, when the climate and environmental emergency that was declared was because, and it was said in Parliament at the time, it was because Extinction Rebellion and other activists were protesting outside the Houses of Parliament. Significantly, it's significant because the effects of climate change and the narratives, but also the activism, is having a physical and mental health impact on young people. And many of them talked about that I'll come to later on. It's also important and significant because the environmental activism has been evolving and changing to circumstances, not only because of COVID, but also in order to draw more media attention to what's going on. We can talk about that. So something else that strikes me as significant, because the activists are widening the issues under discussion and making links between different things, not just climate change, but also linking it to other issues like not only climate justice, but social justice, feminism, and lots of other inequalities that we're seeing coming up more and more in our interviews with young people. And so it's not just about the environment, and it's making the links between the current, crises, the energy crisis in Britain, for example. Everything is being linked up, and we've seen things evolve. There are more and more links being made. It's significant that all the young environmental activists are not all the same, the way they're portrayed often in the mainstream media. And we've interviewed many people with young people from different ages and different backgrounds, and they're not all white, middle-class young women, that's for sure. And lastly, I think it's significant because young environmental activists are engaging in do-it-ourselves politics, a concept that I developed, I'm going to talk a bit about now, very briefly. So do-it-ourselves politics is doing politics outside traditional collective structures, so not within political parties and trade unions, so in protest actions and other kinds of actions. And it's something that's more personalized. It can be through lifestyle, everyday politics, identity politics. And we know that young people are more and more engaging in these forms of political participation that are outside electoral or institutional politics. So doing politics in a more personalized kind, not pick and mix, but a more way that suits their own beliefs, values, and way of acting. Beyond acting individually, it's more, and I see it more and more as acting collectively through fluid, horizontal, leaderless networks that correspond to environmental activist movements that say that they have internal democracy. That's not necessarily true, but there's a capacity for self-organization, more bottom-up and grassroots, so the very opposite of what these hierarchical political parties do. And through doing politics collectively with friends, family and peers or different groups, it's a way to do it together to influence political decision makers. So it's a way of doing politics to have some kind of agency, some feeling of efficacy, but also doing it with other people. And we'll see that through some of the things that I'm going to be saying later on. So do it ourselves politics came out of, first of all, work I was doing with Judith Besson on young people regenerating politics in our book that we edited volume. And then I kind of developed it more when I was writing my monograph that you can see there. And then through interviews, it became more and more obvious that this was really a fact of doing something was very important, and doing it collectively, as we'll see. So I mentioned some of the doing some of the interviews. So started off doing interviews with Ben Bowman at Manchester Metropolitan and Dana area, who's at Nottingham Trent. And I did some first interviews in March, and then we got together and did a whole series of interviews over the few years. We interviewed people in Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, but other movements as they came along. And we did interviews in Edinburgh, Glasgow, at COP26, in Manchester, Nottingham, Sheffield, and Paris. I didn't do them in Edinburgh or Manchester, but I did them in the other places. And we did lots of interviews from people on their own, mostly before and after protest action. So either interviews before a protest was going to take place or afterwards. We didn't actually interview people when they were protesting. We left them to it and took photographs, and you can see some of them. And some of them are really, long extended interviews. Some of them, like I did one in an occupied shopping centre in Paris, or ones that lasted longer in Sheffield before young people were going to go down to the Extinction Rebellion fortnight in October 2019. So there were all sorts of age ranges. The youngest people that we interviewed were 12, and the oldest was 34. They said themselves that they were young, and we all know about how we're always being asked, when does young begin and end? But they said that they were young, so we interviewed them, and of course we got ethical consent from them, and those that were under 16 had parents who signed those consent forms as well. Very definitely they weren't all female, but most were, and they were not all white either. There was some ethnic diversity and differences in social economic backgrounds. That's something that Dana and I have been working on, about interviewing young people who don't fit the stereotypical environmental protesters. And just so we got hold of them through social media, or we wrote to them, or we went up to them before and after protests, as always. So we wanted to find out who, why, and who. We wanted to understand if there were any generational specificities, whether they constituted a generational unit, if they were doing things different from previous generations of environmental protesters. For example, those that set up Extinction Rebellion that were previously involved in Rising Up in the 90s, and those that were involved in activism in the 70s, etc. We wanted to understand what was going on in terms of values and attitudes or actions, and their agency and efficacy. We wanted to know what was going on to try to understand it. Wanted also, of course, to understand a bit more about whether do-it-ourselves politics seem to apply to what I theorized on. But as well, we wanted to give a voice to these young environmental protesters who very often said that their voices were not heard. We listen very carefully to what they say, and we think that we've pulled out of all of that some stuff that you can't get in many of the quantitative surveys through doing these interviews. So what did they say? So if we just start up about their motivations, I can't actually see my screen because there's a thing saying on recording is on anyway. So just to start off then, so most young people are concerned. Some feel it's too big a problem. They don't know what to do. They feel there's nothing that could be done about it. This is Zed from XR. So they're feeling anxious, and then I'll say A, I don't want to give their first names. I think the way to deal with this heaviness is to do something. That's rather than just lie in bed and think, I can't sleep, everyone is going to die. So there's a really, kept coming up was this existential anxiety linked to climate change and the climate crisis. Not only because of the narratives used by the social movements, but because these young people were thinking for themselves and thinking about what was going on and their place in the world. And so Oliver, said, I felt an obligation to do it. I can't stay here and be content. It's about how I relate to these things, a consciousness. I'm taking time out from study and working to help the rest of society. So he makes, many of them talked about existential feelings, and that how they felt the obligation, almost it wasn't a choice, it's a job that had to be done and they had to get on with it. And so, for example, I have a little sister. She was telling me she was stressed out about damage to the planet. It made me sad and furious because the government could do something about it. And so this is very typical of the interviews that we saw, that young people went from being anxious, fearful, and then as they become more informed about what's going on, both regarding climate change and inactions from governments, that they shift more towards feelings of frustration and anger. So, for example, Iris, the very youngest one we interviewed, politicians who have a voice for us are not doing enough to help the climate. So she's 12. And so very, very obviously, anger was a mobilizing force. So we hear, many of them said that the government should be doing this. We should be able to elect people to do this, or I'm doing this to make a difference. I feel frustrated and angry. I feel I couldn't do anything. I couldn't get involved. What I could actually do. What can I do? And so I didn't ever ask them about doing, or I didn't actually ever use the word do, but this doing just kept coming up regarding to what the young people themselves could do and what governments were not doing. So there are a few more quotes, and I like the last one at the end. What would you say to the if the Prime Minister were here? I'd ask, what are you doing to protect the future of your children and young children and your grandchildren? So it's not only, they're only thinking, these young people are not only thinking about themselves, they're thinking about future generations and the impact of governments not doing anything on it. So what's clear is that, I'm just going to see if I can move the thing on the screen. There we go. So some thoughts on it is that young environmentalists experience many emotions about climate change, often as an existential crisis, and feel that nothing can be done due to the scale and the urgency. And this is reinforced by the movements themselves, the narratives. And the young environmental activists initially feel they can't do anything because of anxiety and fear, and they feel that power holders do not do anything, so they feel frustration and anger, and then they consider their future is compromised because power holders do not listen to their voices and don't do enough. I'm just going to show you, I'm just going to skip down to, I can't move it there. So, for example, that in this slide, you can see that this is in France, where it's a generation no future, or a portrait of young people on fire, that they're feeling these strong emotions because not only as a generation, but also because of climate change and inaction from governments. And lastly, that these young environmental activists sense that politicians don't do enough because they care less about the young generation and more about money, which creates distrust, mistrust, and disgust in politicians. And that you can see, this is another one from France. At the bottom, it says, utopia is to still believe in capitalism. And something that evolution in the mobilizing factors of young people, the motivations, is more and more making links between the climate crisis and other things. And this is coming out very much so in COP26. And here are just a few pics that I took that are very much underlining the link. As you can see in the top right, ecology is not economy, eco not ego, reduce, reuse, revolt, etc. And there are and it was really very obvious at COP26 that the emphasis on the economic aspects of it, as you can see here, time for degrowth, strike back against capitalism, etc. But also, I could say that there were lots of things about, you can see on the bottom left, which is where the rallying point, the beginning point of one of the demonstrations, about the links to colonialism and the impact of that on the climate change, and that how that needs to be addressed as well. I'll carry on. So if we just talk a bit about mobilization and methods, I can answer more questions. 5 minutes, Sarah. Yep, I'm near the end. So just a few quotes on what young people said about mobilization that struck me as being important is that, for example, this young person said, we're building solidarities. We are a collective, a community in a world that makes you feel you are on your own. Or Mitch said, everyone still needs to be part of a community. Everyone needs to look after each other. And if don't, that's how the things spiral out of control. And this is one of, this is from Skylab in Extinction Rebellion in Trafalgar Square. And I asked whether she thought that Extinction Rebellion was radical. She said, we are radical in our kindness, which is really something that struck us, Deno and Ben. We wrote an article about this idea about how the importance of caring and sharing and being in a community, but also doing things together. So for example, Molly said, I specially made the placard for today. We deliberately decided to do it together, chilling. Afterwards, I'll put it up on my room in a special place. So it's actual doing of things, doing the things together and doing it within a movement that creates positive emotions. But also, more and more, we're seeing the emphasis on disruptive action. So for example, Zoe, the only way to draw attention to this huge problem is by being disruptive, to wake up the public, to disrupt the government, people on the street, the police and the state. It's more effective. And we're seeing more and more through creative and imaginative actions, disruptive actions. And Extinction Rebellion went into the House of Commons last week, and glued themselves to various places, sung, etc. They're not all young, I should emphasize that. I'll come to that in a minute very briefly. So just a few words on mobilization and methods then. They feel disappointed in hierarchical politics. This includes the Green Party. I've asked young people about their attitudes to the Green Party, and many say that the Green Party is not doing enough. It's part of the institutional politics, and that they're not doing enough because of the urgency and the scale of things. And they're also making links with other issues, as I mentioned earlier. And so there's a tendency to prefer these horizontal movements with internal democracy that I mentioned earlier, which gives the autonomy to do things, and that within these movements to do disruptive actions, it's more productive to sensitize the media, public and politicians and power holders about climate change. And so they're using creative and imaginative ways of non-violent direct action offsets negative emotions of what I mentioned earlier on, and that through doing these collective actions they're discovering voice and political efficacy, and in a more positive light it brings joy, belonging and sense of hope and change. So I've only got a few minutes left, so I'll just wrap up. So we all know that young people are not all the same, even though they often treated as a monolithic group. But also not all young environmental activists are the same. We're working more and more on these non-typical people to understand why and how, or why not they're participating. And of course, all activism is not the same. It's important to underline that access to environmental activism is not the same. It depends on when you live. It's easier to take part if you're living in London than if you're living in the countryside. So there's a different urban, rural difference. It depends on your income. Can you provide for yourself or others when you have to go and protest? Depends on your background. With that ethnicity, it's more difficult to, for example, be prepared to be arrested if you know that it's difficult for you regarding the police and getting a criminal record, or if you want to become a teacher. And it's more difficult if you have other responsibilities, either being working, student or caring. And that can lead to some form of isolation and exclusion from certain environmental movements, both internally and externally and in action. So in our most recent interviews, it's really come across that environmental activism is hard work and it's not always fun, leading to burnout, compromises, exclusion, and lots of negative emotions about actually participating and the movements themselves. The inaction from politicians is detrimental to democracy. It leads to disappointment, distrust, disgust in institutional politics. And this has real kind of going forward, what's going to happen in Britain today. We're going to have a new Prime Minister who has been very forthright in her opposition to environmental policies, be it green taxes or in favour of shale extraction, etc., etc. So this going forward, what's that going to have an impact on actual voting and representative democracy? But I'll try to finish on a positive note, as I've said before. Then taking part is a way to bring about positive emotions. And it's also beyond emotions. It's showing, we've seen that it is actually having an impact. And that's what I'm working on going forward, is to work on the actual impact, the outcomes and the results of this environmental activism. Now we've got time to look back at what's been going on. And so that's about it, really. And there's tons of references, and I'm happy to send anybody this. And thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. So we'll have a couple of questions from the audience now that are in the chat. So if you came a little bit late, can you please, for the rest of the talks, place some questions there. So the first one is from Milo Key. Regarding the broadening of goals towards ecological justice, not just environmental justice that you mentioned, are there any articulations from your participants about why activists have linked the two, other than the system and growing distrust in institutions?
Hi, I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but what's clear is that they're making a link between environmental injustice, social injustice, economic injustice, because they're all linked together. And so, because these young people tend to be more interested in issues rather than political parties, they're linking up these different issues. What's really striking in the recent interviews I did in Paris is how making links between feminism, inequalities and environmental inequalities, and that it all fits into a way of seeing things, that how political systems need to change, the way of doing politics needs to change, and that everything is linked. And it shows that young people are not naive or, or don't understand, or immature that are often made of them, is that they're taking in the information and thinking about it and making the links that some people don't want them to make. Does that make? Yeah.
And linked to that, and I like this question, so as an adult researcher, was there any skepticism towards yourself and maybe associating with you with the system, or do academic communities kind of sit outside of this?
I have to say that only one person has ever refused an interview, and it was in Trafalgar Square, and it was a person from Extinction Rebellion, and they said to me, "I'm not sure I will be able to give you the right answers or the correct answers." And I thought that was a very interesting answer in itself. It was more like, I want to make, am I on message? Are they on message? Now, what we found, the best way it takes a lot of energy to interview young people, but beyond that is that the best way we found to do it was to go through the placards, because we asked people, can you tell us about the first questions, or can you tell us, after all, the ethical consent, which is an obstacle, of course, but I think you find that young people really want to be heard, and they're really not grateful, that sounds condescending, but they're pleased wants to be listened to and somebody to take attention to them. But going up and asking, can you tell us about your placards? So sometimes they were drawing them before, they were like sitting down drawing them. More recently, they've been using the same placards for the last 3 years. I've interviewed plenty of young people who said, we've used this in previous generations. But going up and saying, can you tell us about your placard? What have you made it from? Who did you make it with? What are you going to do with it afterwards? Who would you like to share it to? And what does it mean to you? And with that, that's just open. That is kind of giving a positive questions and enabling them to answer. So lots of questions. More and more, we're asking fewer questions, because young people that do answer have so much to say, and obviously it's better just to listen sometimes. No, but placards, no, nobody ever, and nobody's ever said no.
There's a question here that you mentioned too, around the kind of imperialism thing that was written on the sign. Are people in the UK, young people in the UK, associating these movements, grappling with British imperialism and the climate crisis? Are there any points of contact or connection or contrast with conversations about First Nations justice and racial justice?
Yeah, it's a very big difference between France and Britain. The links to climate injustice and climate change and the global north and the global south is discussed in Britain, but it hasn't been discussed by anybody that I mentioned in France. But of course, those photos came from COP26 when it was the big thing that was being discussed. And I could have shown you lots of clips of people speaking and other photographs where there was a definite link between Britain's colonial past and injustices. And yeah, absolutely. I can't actually read the question. Yeah, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Thanks. And lastly,
and I can just add for the young people that we've been interviewed that don't fit the white middle class young woman narrative, they obviously are underlining this a lot, and whether it's because they have family members in countries that are in former colonies of Britain, but also because they're aware of it, but also other young people that are very much aware that it's the global south in poorer countries that are already more affected, we've just seen it in Pakistan, by climate change. Yeah, there's a great awareness of it among the people that we interviewed, yeah.
Okay. And lastly, and it kind of relates to what you just said really, is that of the people you spoke to, there aren't the kind of the traditional stereotype of the young climate activist, white and middle class, I suppose. Did those speak of impediments in participating in these kind of actions?
Yes, we did some with Dana. We did an in-depth interviews with some young men, brown, from working class backgrounds. They discussed about how just to participate financially, it was more difficult for them because they couldn't afford train fares, they couldn't afford to take time off work, or they had to study, and they had caring responsibilities. So it was very difficult juggling those actual responsibilities. And so that led to certain tensions about feeling inadequate and not participating enough. And how do you deal with what's on your doorstep and what's outside? They also just talk about how it's much more dangerous to participate because of policing tactics, and that you're more likely to get arrested or apprehended. And it's more difficult if you get to prison, and it's kind of jeopardizes your future. So that makes it difficult for them as well. They also talked about how within certain movements that they don't necessarily feel welcome, or that those particular environmental movements or groups are not as inclusive, whilst saying that they are, but they're not, because they're not taking into account the difficulties for those particular young people, and that creates all sorts of difficulties as well, and that how they have moved to other movements like Global Justice Now, which is a much more ethnically diverse kind of movement and more inclusive. And so we've seen among Extinction Rebellion, there's lots of splinter groups, be it Scientist Rebellion that I followed at COP26, and other splintered movements where there are different movements, but that doesn't fit the positive narrative of those movements. But I can assure you that there are lots of tensions.
Yeah. Okay, thanks so much, Sarah.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And if anyone has more questions for Sarah, we'll have some time right at the end. If you want to again put them in the chat, and we can direct them towards Sarah then. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we're going to move on to Julia Coffey and Akane Kanai. I'll get you to share your screen, what you're doing. And they're going to talk about everyday feminisms, exploring contemporary digital feminist learning and activism. And I'll just jump on and tell you when there's about 5 minutes to go.
Sure, thanks, Steve. And thanks to everyone for coming today. Really appreciate it. Really interesting hearing from Sarah first. I think there are some connections with our work, so I guess I'll just jump in. First of all, just wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Wurundjeri land today, and Julia is speaking from Darkinjung land. But today we're talking about 2 projects. So the first one I'll talk a bit about, which is one that's ongoing at the moment. That's okay, Julie, you can move on to the next one. But just to give some context of both these projects and the interest in them, what we can see is that over the past number of years, feminism has enjoyed the kind of resurgence in visibility in popular culture, across social media culture, and across media culture, news culture in general. In 2016, we can see that there's a lot of talk of celebrities, for example, starting to adopt feminism in terms of public identities that had previously been sort of repudiated or disavowed. In late 2017, we see the resurgence of Me Too, evidently a movement that didn't just start in 2017, but gained a lot of momentum through the disclosures of a number of a culture of sexual assault in Hollywood. And at the same time, we see this kind of resurgence more generally in social media culture of activism. So of climate change, as Sarah has talked about, but also Black Lives Matter. And we can see that also becoming quite visible in the last couple of years as well. So there have been many different ways to talk about this academically. And one term, for example, that has been used quite a lot recently has been the term popular feminism. That was coined by Sarah Benet-Weiser. So that's to indicate the way in which feminism is both increasingly popular in terms of being liked, but also popular in the sense that it's a space of struggle over meaning. So there's a lot of forces of power at play in what counts as feminism. Next slide, Julia, thank you. So what we can see is that in these contexts that there's not really an agreed definition of activism, particularly with feminism, as a movement that's always been both personal and political, something that's always been a way of understanding one's own personal and intimate experiences in relation to, I guess, broader structures. So what we see then, I think, is while there's also these kind of movements of activisms across social media culture, and you can see in public culture, there were also big walks in sort of mid-2010s, like slut walks, for example. In a lot of the literature, there was still not very much understanding of the personal everyday consequences and what that meant for subjectivity for feminists that were engaging with this kind of rise of feminism. So it was less understood on a personal everyday level. And that's part of why we were interested in pursuing these projects. Julia, such great timing. But okay, so I'm going to talk about this current project that I'm working on. So this began last year under lockdown. So in 2021, I conducted a number of focus groups with 50 young feminists aged 18 to 28 across Australia. And you're welcome to ask more about the breakdown of this cohort in question time. But I'm just trying to keep it short for the paper at the moment. But I conducted focus groups over Zoom, basically to assess the main themes and what young people are finding useful and what detracted from their feminist social media engagement. And this was really broadly framed because what we know is that a lot of people aren't necessarily commenting, or they're not necessarily posting, they're observing. And I mean, lurking is one word you might use, or you might use, you know, following Kate Crawford, listening on social media. So focus groups sort of established the main themes and patterns of what people were finding useful and less useful in their social media, feminist social media engagement. And that was followed up with one-on-one interviews where participants shared examples of their feminist social media feeds with me and reflected on them and discussed them in the context of their everyday lives. At the moment, I am now in the process of engaging with the participants again in follow-up interviews 1 year on. And that's just to give participants, I mean, also an opportunity to reflect and revise those narratives. And, you know, since given the age bracket, there's often a lot of movement and change in passing through institutions and different milestones as well. So this was part of the impetus of the design. So I'm just going to talk about a few themes briefly, and there's so much in this project. So this is just really a glimpse, I guess, of some of those themes, and which are all, I think, very complex and differentiated for different groups of the participants. But in broad terms, I'm going to first talk about the theme of individual responsibility. So something I think that is really amplified by social media culture, and that was really clear for my cohort, was a huge, really heavy sense of individual obligation. And that was to iterate one's politics in one's life in every way that was possible. And particularly for younger participants, this was translated into really being visible with your politics online. So if you weren't visible when there was a particular event happening, so last year, for example, with the Taliban retaking Afghanistan, you know, there would be this kind of sense of being a hypocrite or being inconsistent or not being one with your politics. So one participant who headed up a collective, a feminist collective at uni, said, you know, you need to post on everything. And if you get to a point where you don't post, people are going, you know, you haven't posted on this, like we expect you to post on this. And the rate of change of all these events, particularly in social media attention cycles, was, you know, pretty exhausting, because there was this kind of sense you had to be on top of everything, but there was such a wide range of events and matters that could be linked to feminism that required one's knowledge and attention. Next slide, please, Julia. Thank you. Another big theme, I guess, linked to this kind of sense of individual responsibility was the fear of getting it wrong. So there was often a sense that there was a clear right way to act and be visible, and that to get it wrong was to be problematic, to be you know, politically impure, and that was something that carried consequences that were very difficult to deal with. And I think that the stresses of this were often amplified for participants who, I think, for some participants who had fewer professional resources for kind of working out things collectively, working out collective strategies. So it could often boil down to these intense anxieties of online posting, where people often had these kinds of frameworks of feeling intersectionality meant ticking a billion boxes, right? So this created really intense stresses about posting. So, you know, one of my participants talked about there being just so much information, we're so bombarded with information. If I make a post, there's always going to be 1,000 things that I'm leaving out. And they talked about how they really were passionate about, for example, last year to encourage vaccination, for example, but they were just really feeling paranoid and worried about getting the right resources out there. So this was overwhelming. They said it's also why I'm hesitant to repost these things, because there's so many different sides of that issue. And yet, if you remember this intense responsibility to be visible so that your politics, you know, reflected who you were and your voice was being used, your platform was being used. Next slide, please, Julia. Okay, so I've kind of canvassed some of the more, I wouldn't say darker, but some of the things that really weighed on participants. Another element, though, I think that's also really important to recognize is how different social media cultures could really provide avenues for participants to feel validated if they were managed to find the right groups, the right kind of influences, the right tone, because a lot of participants were feeling, you know, this struggle of finding their own identities, the way, you know, so for example, one participant said it was so amazing for them being young and learning about trans for the first time, because even though they didn't come out as trans till much later, this gave them vocabulary for it. And other participants with chronic illnesses that were often linked to reproductive issues found, you know, really supportive voices online that validated the sense that, you know, they hadn't been listened to by their doctors, or their pain had been minimized. And Sarah Benet-Weiser again has talked about believability being such a huge issue for women, often in these sort of in medical institutions. Other participants talked about simply being able to recognize difficult situations as unfair, and that being a really huge thing for them. So that could be in relation to their friends, seeing, you know, what their a relationship that a friend had with, you know, an intimate partner being unfair, or for themselves personally, I can recognize a lot of situations I might have been in that don't marry up with my values. And I can identify that now because of feminism, and that's given me the tools to do so. And next slide, please. Sorry, Julia, could you go to the next slide?
Sorry, it's just not doing it.
Oh no, not loading.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there we go.
Awesome, thank you. But something I just want to talk about just before concluding is that it was really important to think through how participants' own social groups and resources really shaped how much they needed social media and what they were able to draw on otherwise. Because as you can sort of see, for a lot of participants, it was pretty overwhelming sometimes being connected to feminist social media culture, or social media culture in general, through which, you know, their feminism was being filtered. So though everyone acknowledged really positive things, most, I think, needed some space away to detox as well. But for many, it was incredibly helpful to have friends with whom they could really talk through some of the issues. And you could see real, I guess, differences in the confidence of some participants who had, you know, different spaces through which to talk through a lot of issues, because sometimes, you know, online, there wasn't necessarily the space to ask questions or talk them through. So this was noted by one participant who said that they noted, and it was sad, that it was difficult for some participants in different social media groups who didn't have the most up-to-date language around these cultures, which I call knowledge cultures, who didn't have the words and vocabulary to clearly and sensitively articulate what they were trying to say. And because there was this kind of sense of, you know, there's a lot of risk online as well, a lot of the possible, I guess, problematic things could be shut down quite quickly. So it's really important, I think, in this project to situate how people were doing, how useful online spaces were really also fed into participants' broader networks. I think I'm done there, so I'll just pass on to Julia. Hopefully I didn't go too much over time, Julia.
No worries, hopefully I can get the slides to keep moving.
It's about 6 minutes to go.
Okay. Yeah. So the project that I guess came before this one that Akane is doing at the moment is very related, obviously, but I just wanted to discuss some of the different aspects of that connect. So Akane led this project as well, and I was a co-researcher on it. It was the Feminist Deliberation online project. So we sought to try to explore digital feminist spaces and self-identified feminists who participated in them, to try to figure out how feminist learning occurs within those spaces, what the kinds of activist and agonistic potentials were of those spaces, and how they were navigated, particularly how people within these spaces grappled with the complex ideas of difference and intersecting oppressions, and yeah, how they're sort of performing or negotiating feminist identities within those spaces, connecting with some of Akane's previous work. So yeah, we did 2 participatory workshops in Melbourne and Newcastle and follow-up interviews with yeah, a range of different participants that I can discuss a bit later, but I'll just try to get to the content so I don't run out of time. So we're really interested to explore the significance of the body within this learning space of digital feminist activism. So we tried, you know, in these participatory workshops to start with some feeling cards. We asked people to write down what feelings or things they felt in their bodies when they encountered conflict in feminist online spaces. Some people said, you know, curiosity. Other times there was frustration, bemused or amused, flooded, heart rate up, eek, says one of them, heart racing and face flushing. So I guess some quite, yeah, reactive kinds of feelings associated. And we use this as a way to sort of start drawing in the yeah, felt and embodied personal dimensions of this sort of public online interaction. Even though they were in private spaces, often in private groups, they were still, you know, quite public in other ways with other groups of feminists. So we were interested in looking at how these kind of affects or feelings, registers in the body sort of led to the possibilities for or restrictions on further participation in these groups. So just a couple of examples. Sometimes, you know, the feeling of irritation, even if it results in, you know, flushed face or heart rate, can mean you're drawn in, you, as Heather says here, too narked to let something pass by. So, you know, that feeling of, I can't let that go, it sort of hooks you in. And connecting to what Akane was saying in relation to her most recent project, that sense of individual responsibility was really important as well, feeling like I had to say something, as they often would say, or as Avi describes, you know, as a feminist, you're expected to take a stand on certain issues, has to be an either or. But she was describing that this expectation meant that she would then just actually wouldn't participate or comment at all because it's too exhausting to be part of every single thing. So because she doesn't like confrontations, she just doesn't sort of comment or post anymore. So it's this, I guess, that tricky balance between wanting to defend marginalized members of groups of society or groups that people might moderate in these spaces. But yeah, it can also be extremely tiring, as they said, and lead to disconnection, or like Avi did. But, you know, being disconnected or not being able to engage also registers emotions of guilt a lot of the time. So saying, you know, I wish I could, but I just don't have the energy, self-preservation. So Ella talks about being a bit emotionally disconnected, which doesn't even think about engaging. And also the proximities that occur within, or the lack of face-to-face that Quinn talks about here, that occurs on Facebook, is another kind of exhausting or draining dimension that can, I guess, cause those kinds of disconnection. So just to finish up, we can obviously talk more about this in questions, but we were looking at exploring how these digital feminist spaces are really fraught, but at the same time, important learning spaces for learning and connection. So even if people couldn't participate in them by posting anymore, they would still be part of those groups and sort of form an important part of identity and connection. But just, I guess, wanting to acknowledge the amount of labour that goes into portraying or performing the feminist self in these spaces. It's such an active space of learning and of tension. And just there's some further resources here if anyone's interested. I could share these, but yeah, we created an inclusive feminist discussion fact sheet with Gender Equity Victoria. There's an open access journal article by Akane and other authors, and also Akane's project website there as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Akane and Julia. So any questions that you have at this point, can you please put them in the chat? There's one here from Hannah. A question for Akane regarding fear of getting it wrong. Do you think there's kind of like age or cohort or issue specific things going on there, or platform specific? Do you have kind of more thoughts you could share on the kind of worries about getting it wrong online?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good question. I don't think it's platform specific necessarily. I think that was something that carried through. I think it carried through into offline life as well. And there were many different platforms that participants were using. But I think the fear was, I think, probably more intense for younger participants because they, I think, often, I mean, online spaces were kind of more the central spaces where they could express their voice and where they could be listened to. So I think that, as opposed to sort of having it more diffused, so I think that was definitely more age specific. And I think it also probably came up a little bit more in relation to issues where they could not speak directly from experience. But this is also difficult because even if you have the experience, it doesn't mean that, you know, that your version is necessarily might be considered legitimate, right? So, I think with participants' understandings of, you know, being an intersectional feminist, that often placed extra pressure on being across many different issues, even if there weren't things that you didn't, you know like personally through your own what had happened to you, for example.
Yeah, thanks so much, Akane. Stephen, do you mind if I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Just quickly on that one? So I'm really interested in, you say that this is like, you know, a space to express yourself, but also there's a fear of getting it wrong. I'm wondering if you can unpack a little bit more of that tension for me for particularly young people in these online activist spaces. Like, does it stop them from speaking up, do you think? Or it's just a kind of, I've spoken up and I feel heard, but there's a little bit of, you know, worry there?
I think it actually stops most people, also because they don't want to, it's often enough, even if they haven't been, you know, criticized themselves, it's often enough to stop people from saying things and from commenting. Or they'll only comment when they're really driven to the feeling really annoyed. Or, for example, that's something they really are comfortable in talking about, that they know, and maybe they've even done some extra research around it. So, for example, you know, one participant who had already suffered, you know, is very young, but had seen her mother go through an abusive relationship and herself had been through an abusive relationship and had done, you know, then been to uni and started engaging with gender, you know, she felt quite comfortable talking about those things. But then even she, when I caught up with her this year, was talking about feeling burned out as well. So, but yeah, I think the pressure to speak and having the kind of compulsoriness of speech be so important, that actually does produce the inability, I think, to do it sometimes.
Super interesting. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hannah.
Okay, the next question in the chat is asking, how much does gender critical feminism contribute to their sense of fear of getting engaged and to the feeling of being forced to engage in order to demonstrate solidarity with you know, intersectionality, constant need for signaling that kind of that politics?
I think, and maybe Julia wants to speak to this too, but I would say most participants, I guess, I mean, maybe they saw some of that gender critical feminism from afar, but it wasn't really so much in their personal lives so much, but they would see that come up. Yeah, and I guess there would be the sense that they would need to engage, or at least like not give attention, or not, you know, I guess feed attention to particular strands of it. But I guess I would say across my cohort, everyone was, you know, really desiring to be very inclusive in their feminisms. And Julie, did you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I think so. I just think it follows on to what you were saying before as well about how people were often, you know, feeling like having experiential basis for whatever comments they were engaging with, or whatever they were prepared to sort of go out and go into battle for is would be an important dimension of that as well.
I'll do two more questions. Firstly, wondering if witnessing or participating in conflict online changed the views of any of your participants. Did these conflicts shape how they felt about or were related to their feminism? I mean, does anyone change their mind online?
I think, I mean, it made people, I would say generally would make them more loath to participate, and that was said sort of explicitly. But I think, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily change the fact that they were feminist. It might, but it might make them feel more disaffected in particular groups, or maybe highlight the need, because there's a very much a thing like, you know, in social media and culture that you need to find your niche and you need to find where you belong, and that kind of enhance the importance of finding like your slot, I guess, rather than necessarily being, being more in sort of general discussions, for example.
Yeah, and I think people though often, I remember they did talk about feeling that, you know, the good thing about these spaces in the rare occasions it happened this way was that it was, you know, ideally people can make mistakes, and, you know, it should be a safe place as well, ideally, to be able to ask questions about things and then, you know, engage with the answers that they're given and learn from them. So in relation to, you know, anything to do with critical race theory or Indigenous issues, you know, people talked about how, I guess the examples are really about people who are talking about doing the educating on those issues would say that people would often take their comments quite well, and they would see that then, you know, their perspectives were being taken up and followed, and that would sort of inform the group as a whole. So it's not sort of, I guess in those settings though, it didn't become conflict. That's the crucial difference. It was more of a discussion, and there was dialogue and engagement rather than a kind of pile-on situation.
And lastly, linked back to the first talk given by Sarah, she mentioned that there was some clear links with, you know, the kind of emotional impacts of kind of activism. Do you have anything to say about kind of links to those kind of things? The emotional kind of impact of this stuff in young people's day-to-day lives?
I think there is, yeah, for sure. I think that the word burnout really like leapt out at me in Sarah's presentation, because that was something different people, you know, it's just a really common way to frame how people were feeling, and yeah, how much energy they could give, I guess. And just I think the constant, I mean, of course, like not everyone felt this to the same extent, but there was just a lot of, you know, assessment of the self, and like whether you were measuring up to this kind of sense, you had to push yourself more, learn more, do more. So I think there was, yeah, it was quite exhausting in lots of ways.
Excellent. Okay, thanks Akane and Julia. We'll leave that one there. And now I'll get Thias to share his screen if I can. So now we have Thias from the University of Amsterdam, and he's going to talk about young people's friendships and the reproduction of everyday village life in rural Indonesia.
Yes, good day everyone.
And I'll jump back on when there's 5 minutes to go, just to give you a heads up.
Yes, Stephen. Thank you, Stephen. And well, to correct you instantly, I'm recently moved to the VU University in Amsterdam, so it's a bit different from the University of Amsterdam, but indeed that has been my home for many years. Anyway, so based at the anthropology department of VU University in Amsterdam, and today I will talk with you about my research into rural educated young people in East Indonesia and about their troubled education to work transitions. And in particular, I will talk about these young people's enmeshment in their communities, taking as prism their friendships. So this is a quite different context from the previous two presentations, and I hope to keep your attention for those who are a bit unfamiliar with the Indonesian case. Let me see if I can go to the next slide. Yes, that's it. So my argument is that these young people's friendships are primarily about having fun, mixed gender socializing, and peer-to-peer care relations. Yet at the same time, they also facilitate the reproduction of valuable norms that form the essence of these young people's communities. And as a result, young people can act good even when their education to work transitions are fractured. Now, this paper is the result of previous work for which I did field work in 2013, 2014, quite a while back. And since then, I've moved on to do new research and to sort of anticipate my conclusions in the theme of today, which is young people making the future. I'd like to talk very briefly about this new research, which is an ethnographic study into, and this is something quite different from the current topic, rural value change with a particular focus on small fish trading networks in East Indonesia. Now, this focus is motivated by the fact that locally available small, low-cost fish, which are high in micronutrients, can contribute to healthy diets of marginalized people in out-of-the-way communities. So what we did was to map in various places the trade networks that transport the small fish from beaches and landing sites to rural hinterlands. And I in particular focus on the traders doing all this moving, the moving of fish. And what struck me was that these traders are often young men, not necessarily educated, by the way, but that they, through their trading, provide priceless services to impoverished rural communities, which are often imagined as hollowed out places with few young people in stagnant social realities. Now, we can leave this aside for the moment, but I hope to come back to this later and make the story full circle. Right, young people's friendships and the reproduction of everyday village life in rural Indonesia. So what are we talking about? Now, I did my research in Central Flores in Ngada district, which is named after the dominant ethnic in the region, Ngada. Now, Ngada is a relatively isolated district where many people rely on agricultural livelihoods. For example, the community in which I did my research was located only a 10-minute motorbike drive away from the district's capital, where the local bureaucracy offers wage work opportunities. Yet most people in the community where I was based work on their fields and gardens adjacent to the village. Still, when around 2011, the local government installed a hiring freeze because the bureaucracy was considered to be saturated, this was a major concern or major problem for many local young people, especially for those who had returned to their rural natal communities with tertiary degrees from city-based universities, which are mostly located on other islands in Indonesia. And that is because there's hardly a private sector in Ngada that provides alternatives to government jobs, and agriculture isn't a viable option either because, well, there's pressures on land, but also because many educated young people do not want to or are not supposed to work the land because, well, they are educated and are imagined both in a national discourse of nation building and development, as in local imaginaries as the vanguard of positive change and ideals of modernity. So one might wonder, why do these young people return to Ngada after their studies anyway? Well, first, educated young people come home because they can't find a job in a city. And this is because youth unemployment is an urban issue as well. And getting a desired but very competitive white-collar job in the city far away from family and social networks is rather difficult. Social capital is a vital aspect of any application process in Indonesia. And without the proper social capital, getting a government job is tricky. And we should note that the educated young people I met often come from rather modest backgrounds and are often the first in their families to go to university, often made possible through the savings of extended kin networks. And as a result, educated young people from Ngada often feel that they only have a chance for these white-collar jobs in their own community where they can benefit from their own networks, though limited they often are. Second, educated young people return home because of their parents. Due to general gendered ideas, young women in particular mentioned that their culture required their return home to their natal community, where they are supposed to provide care work for parents or senior and junior kin. And here the specific cultural context matters too, as women in Ngada are the guardians of clan-owned land and houses, which they are supposed to guard for future generations. And finally, educated young people told me that they felt as if they had a moral obligation to be an agent of positive change in their community. They told me they really want to help develop their community. And this links up to their educated status. You see, as in many other post-colonial states, education has played a vital role in Indonesia's post-independence nation-building process. And education was a vehicle for modernizing the state and still is today. So during their education, young Indonesians are instilled with notions of upward mobility, possible achievement, and being independent. Young people are imagined from a top-down state perspective as human capital, which instills them with notions of development and progress, and the role educated young people can have in their communities. So Indonesian students are formed as self-reflexive and self-responsible subjects, primed to act as the vanguard of positive change in their communities. Yet at the same time, youth, generally speaking, is seen as a threat to social and political order, particularly when imagined trajectories of upward mobility fail to materialize. And this tension is what I initially tried to study in Ngada, because indeed, upon returning Ngada, these educated young people are confronted with an absence in jobs and become unemployed, or rather they become underemployed. And I think this is really important because it turned out that very few of these young people that I met sit at home, wait, or are being idle. Instead, I found the educated young people that I met surprisingly active and busy living their lives and feeling committed to the communities, giving shape to their educated ideals. And they did so in rather modest way, I would say. That is, they weren't at the forefront of any focused attempt of societal change. Instead, they tried to conform to existing scripts of what to aspire to when being educated. So for example, many young people try to volunteer in organizations where they imagine themselves working. And so many graduates wish to be a teacher, a government-supported job that comes with many benefits like a fixed contract, healthcare insurance, and a guaranteed pension. But with such contracts unavailable, young people became volunteers at schools, or they worked on highly insecure contracts that paid only a fraction of the proper salary. Doing so, these young people tried to gain experience and network, but also to put in practice their training and to have something to do. And they saw it as a way of contributing to their communities, following a national discourse that equates education with modernity. Similarly, young people with health-related degrees often volunteered at health posts as nurse, midwife, or nutritionists. Now, both these volunteering teachers and nurses were actually doing work. It wasn't that they were redundant staff. They were being recognized as valuable employees in understaffed and underfunded organizations. And by actively contributing to local schools and health posts, these educated young people were appreciated. Meanwhile, young people volunteered for church activities or worked for temporary government projects like manning polling stations during elections or making notes during neighborhood meetings. These educated young people, though underemployed, were not marginal to their communities. Though upward social mobility was hard to achieve, they didn't imagine themselves as failures. They were not a threat to social order, to existing hierarchies, and instead they were what I've called in the middle of things. Now, often when I talk about the predicaments of these underemployed, educated young people in conferences or at events like this, people suggest to me that these educated but underemployed young people are, in a way, reciprocating the investment kin people have made in their education. Or, as the young people are dependent on kin networks for food, housing, and some money during their underemployment, that their volunteering is a way of repaying build-up debts, or that it is mainly opportunism of young people. And I think that such comments are right to some degree, but that they're also too functional and do not do justice to the positive transformative capacity these young people have. And indeed, when talking about making the future, I think it's almost cynical to frame young people's activities in terms of opportunism only. Now, surely these young people were pragmatic and tried to establish themselves within existing hierarchies. Yet we should not forget that they also feel connected to Ngada. Despite their underemployment and the fact that they struggle to become financially independent and hence to become fully accepted social adults in their communities, they don't really seem to be in a marginal or contested social position. Instead, they're actually trying to be good. But more importantly, they're also enmeshed in their communities, contributing to their vibrancy. And this, I think this is particularly clear when we look at the mundane acts of socializing. And so let me briefly explain. There are very few youth-specific places in Ngada where educated young people hang out in exclusive groups. Youthful socializing occurs mostly at the church, and Central Flores, the vast majority of the people identify as Catholics, and the nearby village. So they socialize mostly at the church and the nearby village green, on the road and at the roadside and at parties. And as a result, educated young people casually interact there with their extended families, neighbors, non-educated peers, and other community members while socializing with their friends. Now, this socializing is rather mundane. In my 2020 paper, I give ethnographic vignettes of how mixed gender groups casually hang out on the village green while other community members pass by. I give examples of how young people eat, drink, and dance, frequently held parties together with their parents, uncles, and aunts, and extended family network in general. Educated young people participate in often held rituals, eager to learn about its meaning, enjoying the social atmosphere. If young peer groups go out to other places, they often go to beaches or to nearby hot springs. And these places are popular with families too. Young people hang out on roadsides at the end of the day together with neighbors. Peer groups hang out together on the church grounds, engaging in sports activities or some light volunteering like cleaning. And though the church grounds are a bit more exclusive, the association with the church makes it a rather innocent place. And in fact, educated young people in Ghana often use choir practice, Bible reading groups, or church-organized self-improvement sessions as moments of fun, as well as moments of solace where they can share the stuff that's on their mind. So educated young people's friendships are encapsulated in the day-to-day affairs of other villagers, often highly visible in places that people pass by on their way to visit family, when returning from work in the fields, or while engaging in activities for the local parish. And as a result, these relatively educated young people's friendships contribute to a general buzz in their communities. They made the situation lively, or to use the Indonesian word, rame. Now, liveliness is important. In Ngada, it is associated with strong interpersonal emotional connections. As others have argued, among the Ngada, notions of the self are subordinate to feelings of interdependency between people, ancestors, and the land. And there is a being with, which is maintained through ritual physical representations of common ancestors, for example, in specific clan-related sacrificial posts and livelihood strategies, including labor cooperation and food sharing. And similar ideals of being with can be seen in practices of making liveliness among Manggarai people who live directly to the west of Ghana. Now, to the Manggarai, liveliness is a kind of protective, effervescent social buzz created through the numerous everyday and ritual events. It's about creating crowded situations, about being together, and about an interpersonal quality contrasted with being aloof or being proud. And in particular, the Manggarai make liveliness through hospitality. So where others place this being with among the Ngada largely in custom, and the Manggarai make liveliness through making guests, I locate liveliness in the everyday. So in many ways, young people's underemployment is problematic. For example, on a personal level, these young people might feel frustrated and depressed and anxious. On a larger level, they remain financially dependent on kin and cannot easily progress into social adulthood. There are other issues that require more time to properly explore. For example, these young people cannot contribute to bright wealth arrangements, ritual costs, or the educational trajectories of younger kin. But rather than being disruptive, these underemployed young people, through their friendships, create positive connections between themselves and the community at large. That is, making liveliness among friends transcends the boundaries of close peer groups, entangling young people in Ngada with the community at large. Their friendships are embedded in church activities, daily socializing on the village green, and regular parties and celebrations, all of which contribute to a village's social buzz. Now, it's not only that educated young people act good through their volunteering and underpaid work-like activities. Looking at these young people's friendships, it's obvious that these young people feel at home in their communities and feel part of it. They are enmeshed in their villages, reproducing its very social fabric, which is maintained in the everyday. It shows that young people contribute to their community's well-being. They keep them vibrant. And here, I'd like to come back to the small, low-cost fish value chains I talked about earlier. You see, in places where more than 40% of the children under 5 are stunted due to malnourishment, young traders provide extremely valuable services to their communities by providing access to nutritious food stuff like the small fish. These traders enable people's futures, quite literally by keeping people healthy and nourished. And these young people often do so in quite innovative ways, providing flexible and resilient networks while providing in their own livelihoods, though perhaps in a rather limited way. And it's about, again, it's about making lively rural futures. When we see young people in cynical terms of opportunism, repaying debts of reciprocity only, we might miss the vital role young people have in maintaining their community's well-being. Enmeshment is, to me, a good term to think with when we consider young people, whether educated or not. And that is because this term stresses the everyday, the mundane, the non-spectacular, highlighting young people as part of intergenerational networks. Indeed, by seeing young people as enmeshed, we open up ways to appreciate the ways in which they actively make communities lively and vibrant, making rural futures. I'm almost done. Where they make the community lively and vibrant, making rural futures possible on a day-to-day basis. Thank you. That's it, Stephen.
Thank you. Sorry, I jumped in 30 seconds too early there. Excellent. Thanks for that. So yeah, if we have some questions, could we please put them in the chat, please? We have one here that asks, okay, does the enmeshment of the young people in your research relate at all to mobility imperative? For instance, does this make it difficult for them to leave for better employment opportunities elsewhere? If so, is there any social pressure on them to leave or perhaps stigma associated with staying?
Well, for starters, I think that the gender component is important here. Young women in particular are supposed to return to their native community. And again, like I mentioned, it's not a sort of general gendered ideal. It's also the cultural context of Ngada, where women are the guardians of land. So it's a matrilineal society. Houses and land are given through the maternal, through mothers to daughters. And in most cases, after marriage, the new couple lives with the wife's family. So for young women in particular, it's rather difficult to leave or after they return. But then again, if you have younger sisters or perhaps an older sister who's also living in the area, you might be able to leave again, except that you have to have a clear idea where you're going to. Young men, for example, can easily go on what is called merantau, traveling to find a livelihood. But young women are less free. They cannot go just to any place. They have to have a clear idea where they're going to. Families need to know where they're going to and are going to live with whom. Now, those pressures are obviously less intense for young men. But in the end, a lot of these young men, they feel at home in Ghana. They don't really want to go away. It's a quite spectacular area where they are living. It's very mountainous, a lot of volcanoes. It's very green. The sea is always near, and they always allude to the beauty of the land, the customs, the rituals, the specifics of Ngada culture, which is very different from the other people living in the area. So they feel very connected to their area. And you see, they are educated and they don't really feel that they make a chance of getting inspired to a job in urban places. Moreover, they lack the networks in cities to feel comfortable. In Ngada, they don't really have to worry about food. It's an extremely fertile place. There's a lot of food available. There's fruits year round. There's coffee, extremely good coffee, which is famous throughout Indonesia. And these kind of things sound like they become like metaphors of the good life in Ngada. Whether there's pressure, you see, I'm going back actually to the place where I did my research in 2013-14 in a few months, and I'm very curious how many people are still there. But through social media, it seems most of the people that I met back in the days are still there. So people are quite okay with them being in the area.
Okay. Regarding the underemployed youth, you mentioned that they struggle to become full social adults due to the financial constraints. How does it eventually occur that they're able to gain some sense of financial security or adulthood?
Yeah, so this hiring freeze that I mentioned before, that it's still more or less present. People are hired now and then on contracts, but it isn't like before when there was, well, when you're educated, you're sort of guaranteed to have a job. And that's because there has been a boom in education in Indonesia in the 2000s. And at some point, the local bureaucracies became saturated with all these graduates. And when I came to Ngada, most of these young people hadn't anticipated to become unemployed. And they thought like they had envisioned that they could easily be absorbed by this bureaucracy. Now, slowly jobs are opening up, and for those who are indeed working as an underpaid teacher or as a volunteer, volunteer nurse or nutritionist or midwife, some opportunities open up, and this helps these educated young people to, at some point to get a job. But then again, there's also options to sort of circumvent local custom. It's not a strict system. There's a lot of flexibility possible. And so when you don't have the funds to for example, to pay for bright wealth, when you don't have the funds to contribute to rituals, people find other ways of how you can contribute. So for example, you can contribute with labor, or you postpone bright wealth payments. And if the families both agree that a postponement is okay, these kind of things can happen. So it's about flexibilities in these systems. And well, this relates to the previous question. Perhaps it might also be that at some point people leave the place temporarily to gain some experience or to find some work. And like I said, merantau, to go somewhere to earn some money for building a house, for example.
Thank you. I might open it up now for the other speakers to come back. So could Kane, Julia, and Sarah come back, please? And if there's some more broader questions for all the speakers at once, that would be great. There's one here that's directed to Sarah. You mentioned that the actions by young people of the kind that you talked about are changing the majority mood or opinion. Can you say what you think those changes are?
Okay, yeah, so the impact and the results of environmental activism led by young people, is that what you mean? I'll go with that. Anyway, so yeah, what the next step of my research is like studying the impact on both internally for young people themselves, it's like biographies, narratives of their own activism and what the impact is having on them, but also on more externally on the impact in terms of policy making, declarations, legislation, both in Britain and in France, but in regarding, that will take a longer time, on other more international bodies, but also to see the impact on public opinion of the climate and environmental issues, and the representation of young people and the status of young people and how they're represented. So it's going to be a big job going through, and just because it seems the obvious next step is to see, well, what have been the outcomes, be based on social movement studies and the different internal and external impacts. So yeah, I'm going to go through that. It's a question that I'm often asked, so I thought it was time to address it in more detail.
Judith, do you want to say something there?
Hi, Judith.
Hi, Sarah. How are you? I like your cat. How's your cat? I heard it meowing in the background.
She's a...
Yeah, it's a difficult question that I think about, and I'm not sure how we can tell quite yet to what extent young people in particular are influencing the, government policies or the zeitgeist or, the law. It feels like it's just too early to tell. So I'm interested in hearing what people think, because it could be so many things that are influencing the way that people think. I don't know what the answer is. I'm just looking for answers and listening to what people say about it.
Well, Judith, we edited 3 volumes called When Students Protest and the Outcomes of That. So going on that.
Yeah, but the outcomes or the responses, there are so many, and I think it's a good question, and I'm just not sure. We can talk about the responses that they get from politicians, but the extent to which that then changes politicians' thinking or that leads to policy, it's a tricky question. I don't know the answer.
We'll get there in the end.
Yeah.
I might ask a question to each of the panel members. In the kind of the blurb for our thing today, we're invoking the future, and the future is an important concept in youth studies. The cliche that young people are the future and all that kind of thing. It's also like an effective presence and absent presence kind of thing. Do you want to kind of say something about, what your, I suppose, research participants have to say in terms of their orientation towards the future, whether it's conceptually or empirically? Who wants to go first?
I'll go. I think that's a really interesting question, because I would say that everyone was pretty future oriented, but I think that's also because, the majority of my participants in the project that I was talking about were women. And I think there is this real sense of milestones and things to hit that you have to hit by particular stages, like that kind of, chrononormative. First you start, then you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And even some of my participants this year are talking about, yes, like I've moved here to further my career. I've moved abroad, but then I know it's going to be a few years because then I have to come back, because I know that if I want to have children, I need to start thinking about that now, and then I'll be linked to this and this. So I think it's part of that general milestone thing. But I think there's also, it all kind of melds into, I think, also the sense of being young and the pressure on being young and being the voice of the future. And also, actually, one of my participants said this year was really interesting that, I don't have the exact quote, but something like, you're always racing to be the youngest person to do something. So this kind of future present in the present, but always kind of, you know, working and grinding for like the near future, maybe not the long-term future, but just, yeah, always being oriented to that.
Other members, panel members, sorry. Guys.
Well, yeah, sorry, I can.
No, sorry, I wasn't sure what Steve said there, so I'll just like shush now.
So in terms of future orientations, these young people I hang out with were mostly concerned about, well, mixed gender socializing, basically. They all that was the main thing that was on their mind, finding a future or possible candidate for marriage. And they were all about enjoying life, but the main concern was, yeah, who am I going to marry at some point? Like I said, many of these young people were the first in their families to go to university, so they sort of postponed marriage as compared to the previous generation or as non-educated peers. So they came back and they kind of felt like, okay, I want to marry, I want to seek a suitable candidate. Not yet, I don't want to marry yet, but I need to find a suitable candidate. And that was the main concern that was on my mind, I would say. Not so much finding a job, actually. That they sort of envisioned that coming at some point. But the marriage thing, that was, or the partner thing, that was really important to them. So quite well, in that sense, yeah.
Yeah. Sarah?
Yeah, well, the future is crucial for young environmental activists. And one of the common slogans is another future is possible and system change, but that would involve, you know, reworking how politics is done, having more citizens' assembly, getting more people involved, and changing the capitalist system to be concerned about the environment. So the future, whether it's related to climate crisis or whether actions from political elite and power holders, it looks pretty bleak, but the future is crucial. And that, as you alluded to when you started, Stephen, is that why is the weight of the future generations put on the shoulders of current young people to solve the problems and bring those problems to the attention of those that have the power to do so? And, you know, why should they be responsible for, why should young people be responsible for hope? Why should they be burdened with that when there's all the rest of it going on? And it linked to one of the questions in the chat about intergenerational exchanges and help. A lot of the young people involved in Extinction Rebellion talked about how in their infinity groups, in their local groups, ones that were involved in the town, because there are university groups and groups in the town, they talked about the great positive aspects of being involved in affinity groups with the different generations. So they're brought together by a subject, and that seems very important, and building on previous generations' activism. But also it's a bit complicated because some young people want it to just be a space in demonstrations for young people themselves, whereas, you know, older people should just step back and leave them that space for them and not try to monopolize it or take it over. Whereas so older people would be on the sides or acting as stewards, etc., etc. But so intergenerational solidarity can be shown within process in different ways as well. But yeah, and I think it's important for young people to have their own spaces, but also to be able to share that with older generations, of course. But the future is crucial. It's the very essence.
Yeah, as the comment kind of says there about like intergenerational solidarity, it's like one of the kind of early findings, or I suppose key things that your studies was built on, is seeing the constant process of, as people get older, they seem to take up a almost denigrating orientation towards young people, and, you know, the moral panics and intergenerational things that happen around that. It almost seems kind of innocent now, with like back then, considering now things like climate change are actually imperiling the very idea of the future. So I think
it has to be said that Roger Hallam, one of the founding members of Extinction Rebellion, that's very well known, he hasn't been very generous about young people themselves, and he's been encouraging hunger strikes and getting people to get imprisoned when they're in situations that makes them even more vulnerable. And he's been rather critical of young people's activism and them not getting involved. So that's not very helpful. So I'm trying to show some of the tensions that are involved in these movements are not necessarily positive either.
Okay, I'll move to this the last kind of question. I'll see if I can kind of paraphrase it a little bit for everyone. I mean, so have aspects of intergenerational justice emerged in your work which are not linked to activism? Activism is very present, but not all youth are or wish to be activists, and wonder how they see and think about that aspect. I mean, I suppose this relates a little bit in terms of the Akane and Julia's work on feminism. Maybe in response to this question, you can talk a little bit about like the difference between feminism, capital F maybe, and everyday feminism.
Do you want to
that speaks to kind of the difference between the activist kind of idea and the everydayness of that kind of politics.
I think you speak to this, Akane. This is very much your current project, I think.
Okay. Okay. So, I mean, I think it depends on how well people define activism, because I think it's considered pretty broadly in a social media context where people feel that they can speak up or sign petitions or mobilize and do all those things. But I think in terms of the everyday feminism, I think that there are just ways beyond activism per se, if we think of it more of as a protest or organized type thing. I think there are so many things in young people's everyday lives which, pull on a feminist lens. So one of those things could be friendship, for example. I mean, Tice was talking about the importance of that, but I think the importance of being there for one's friends and being there to listen to them when they were going through things, I think that was something that really came through. I guess I wasn't so much intergenerational because of my current project. It focuses, I guess there's Gen Z and millennial, but do you know what I mean? It's pretty limited age range. But I think if there was also kind of interestingly sometimes a sense of how to build relationships with older mentors, or sometimes I think relationships with one's parents as well, particularly in terms of thinking through gender and looking at, some participants had very thoughtful things to say about their mothers and, how that created anxieties about what they could become and wanting to transcend and surpass what had become available to them. And, so I think there were lots of different ways to think about, I guess, bonds and relationships, in particular through feminism, that wouldn't be considered activism, but thinking more about, fairness in relationships in general, I would say, would be another part of that kind of justice, that feminist justice framework.
Yeah.
Can
I just add to that quickly as well? I think linking sort of to the last questions too about, I guess, which makes it more everyday feminism now, and perhaps how forms of activism, however you define them, are sort of seen as just more of a present way of being, or more possible, or just kind of front of mind, maybe because of the visibility of climate protests as well, and more broader social movement protests like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, just in response to the really is a time of rapid social change. New sociologists have been saying that for decades, but I see it now particularly more than ever. And young people really are at the forefront of educating themselves, their peers, older generations. They position themselves in that way, which is part of the great responsibility and exhaustion and difficulty of being in that space. Because these things really are up for debate at the moment, in relation to trans rights, in relation to climate, in relation to critical race theory, and particularly in the last few years with the Trump era and the rise of populism and those sorts of things. So I don't know, there's a lot going on where all generations kind of need to be connected, and I think there is discussion happening across those spaces, but it's sort of the possibility to be engaged and make a difference is something that I think is being encouraged for a lot of young people, and people are stepping into that space as being one that they see as their responsibility for.
Guys, do you have something to say, like in terms of what's happening with your respondents in this, like kind of the everydayness of their activities and how that relates to the future? And are things like, I know, like I suppose the other two are fairly Western paradigms in terms of what we're talking about here in terms of the discourse. What's the difference, I think?
I mean, it almost sounds like the case I'm talking about is very exceptional in relation to the other two cases, but we should not forget that young people in the globe, I mean, there's hundreds of millions of people still living in rural communities in Southeast Asia alone. So I mean, there's so many communities like the ones that I'm talking about. Yes, the specifics of Ngada matter, but I think that this whole idea of intergenerational connections is quite common throughout rural Southeast Asia and beyond. In terms of everyday activism, I wouldn't really call it that way, activism, but Julia talked about educating peers, educating the older people, younger people, sort of the intergenerational connections. And I think that when we see these young people in Ghana, for example, they really reflect a state discourse, a neoliberal state discourse, and it's all about development, progress. Now, this idea, they really embody this idea from, like, we need to, as educated young people, educate our communities, our kin networks, our neighbors. And what they do, I mean, their volunteerism and their underpaid work is partly motivated by these ideas, but it's not it's not politically motivated in the sense that they want to change structures that much. They talk, it's really in modest terms. They talk about bringing some money to the bank, so when there's need to, you have some reserves. You don't have to fall back on kin networks, and this dependence on kin networks is really obstructing entrepreneurial spirits. So it's I mean, it's in comparison to the marching for green futures or everyday feminism and online becoming visible online. It's rather modest, but for these young people, it's all that it matters. For example, in health posts, people really are passionate about telling people the dangers of eating too much sugar, that it's too expensive, that it's unhealthy. And the same with smoking. It's unhealthy, but it costs a lot of money. You better spend that money or bring that money to the bank to become less dependent on kin networks. Yeah, at the same time, they also sort of celebrate these institutions of shared food, of sharing food or labor arrangements for during harvest time. So it's a very paradoxical kind of getting involved in with these educational this educational spirit.
Yeah, do you want to chip in?
Yep.
Yeah, just to finish then. I think what's interesting is that not all of the young people that we interviewed during and before and after protests actually considered themselves to be activists themselves. So there's a lot of internal inquiry about that, especially the younger ones that were on protest marches and rallies with Fridays for Futures. And regarding everyday politics, that's part of the do-it-ourselves politics, but you know, whether those are individual acts and part of a collective, they're not, most of them don't consider them to be actually effective because they're aware of how the large scale of the problem, but it is a way to influence parents through consumption of products, etc. So there's some intergenerational stuff going on there about the influences on their family members. All right.
Judith, do you want to say something before we finish? Or do you got another question? Yeah.
Just maybe a question. Tears, thank you for your talk. It was great. I liked it very much. When you were talking about how the young people you were working with had a neoliberal subjectivity or identity, I'm wondering to what extent is there in the air any understanding of like the role of the IMF or World Bank and conditional loans and all that sort of stuff, that sort of development ethos and practice, which is just sort of like instilling that identity further and just growing them more. So is that something that you've ever talked to them about? Have they spoken with you about that?
To be very short, no. That's I must say, now I'm doing research about food, and you see that these food policies, which are very developmentalist in Indonesia, it's really it began with the Green Revolution, paid for by the US and the World Bank, and indeed, like you say, it has really shaped this developmentalist state in Indonesia from the New Order, well, basically late Sukarno period, but pretty much in the New Order period. And it's still reflected in current day politics. Coming back to food, there has been, every president has tried to establish mega farms of 1 million acres or something like that. I'm not really into the size of these, but they're huge. And every one of those mega farms has failed. But the current president, again, tries to make such a mega farm in somewhere in the south of Papua, Irian or I'm really not up to date with the current naming of the provinces in the east. But anyway, but it has, I mean, the thinking in local policies is really this top-down narrative, like we need to create an incentive for people to work harder, but a critical reflection on those kind of institutions and mechanisms is not something that is commonly done in places like NADA. What is done is that is just critical reflection, echoing this government discourse on what they call culture, so customary practices. So they really instill this idea of entrepreneurship, of being independent, self-reflexive on these sort of what they see stifling kind of cultural conditions, like kin networks that depend too much on each other.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
We might leave it there. I think I'd just like to thank all our speakers today: Akane, Julia, Sarah, and Thies. The Newcastle Youth Study Centre has these seminars semi-regularly, and we'll be having a kind of 2-day thing later in the year. So please look out for that. If you're interested in being on our mailing list where we send out information, please send me an email and I can add you to that. But thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks to the organisers of Social Science Week.
Thank
I'll leave
you.
it there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Everyone.
Stephen, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.